Hello, IB Biology students. This is section 2 of chapter 2, water. So the first thing we need to know is that water is a polar molecule. How does this happen? Why is water polar? Well, there are covalent bonds that form anytime atoms share electrons. So the polarity of water comes from the nucleus of the oxygen atom, as seen here, which has more protons. So the nucleus in the oxygen atom has more protons. So therefore, it's more attractive to the one electron in each of the hydrogens. So the electron from the hydrogen is pulled closer to the oxygen due to the amount of protons in the nucleus. So this also causes water to be bent and not linear. So it kind of looks like a boomerang, or in baby bio we frequently refer to it as the Mickey Mouse face. And this is because each pole is only partially positive because we are sharing those electrons between the hydrogen and the oxygen, but they are pulled more closely to the oxygen. So this leaves the oxygen end with a slightly or partial negative charge, and the two hydrogens are closer together and having a partial positive charge. Because we're sharing the electrons between the hydrogen and the oxygen, the bond between the hydrogen and the oxygen inside of the water molecule is a covalent bond, a very strong bond. But because we have these partial charges, water molecules can be attracted to other water molecules. And the type of bond that forms between two different water molecules are called hydrogen bonds. Interesting note that hydrogen bonds are not technically bonds themselves, but are intermolecular forces. We've also not proven these hydrogen bonds or intermolecular forces to exist. It's a theory that they exist. But this theory of hydrogen bonding also explains all of the cohesive, adhesive, thermal, and solvent properties of water. So going into the properties of water, first looking at the cohesive and adhesive properties of water. So a single hydrogen bond between two water molecules is not very strong. You need a large number of hydrogen bonds, and then the water molecules themselves become much stronger. Each water molecule can bond with up to 4 others in a tetrahedral arrangement. You can kind of think of it as the carbon element being bonded to 4 different things. So we're looking again at a tetrahedral arrangement. Because of all these hydrogen bonds, the 4 hydrogen bonds in the tetrahedral arrangement, water is cohesive, which means that water sticks to water molecules. But water is also adhesive. It will actually stick to other surfaces or molecules. And these properties lead to 2 different actions, capillary action and surface tension. Capillary action is the ability of water to move up the xylem within a plant against the pull of gravity. And then surface tension is when the surface of water is strong enough to support insects and also causes drops to form. So, adhesion and cohesion are very important and are a result of the number of hydrogen bonds that can form between water molecules. Another property of water is the thermal properties of water, and there are actually 2 thermal properties of water: high specific heat capacity and high latent heat of vaporization. So water has a specific heat capacity, which means that it takes a lot of energy for the temperature of water to change. You may remember this graph from chemistry last year, and going up, it takes a lot of energy to go from these phase changes between the solid to the liquid and then the liquid to the gas. This is a very large amount of energy that's needed. And this is because there are so many hydrogen bonds between water molecules. Remember, we're in that tetrahedral arrangement. But because of this high specific heat capacity, again, the more hydrogen bonds, the more restriction the movement of the molecules, so it's the harder it is to break the bonds. So So this means that the temperature of water remains relatively stable. Most organisms are adapted to a narrow range of conditions. The slow heating and cooling of water are ideal for these organisms. There's less risk of extreme changes within the organism itself. Water can also be a thermally stable habitat for aquatic organisms since the water temperature remains relatively stable compared to either land or air temperature. And you can see that here in the graph. The water temperature over time remains pretty constant with a slight fluctuation in the midpoint of the day, but the air temperature increases and decreases greatly. The other thermal property of water, as I stated, is the high latent heat of vaporization. So this is when water separates from other molecules to become a vapor. So high temperatures damage tissues and denature proteins, which causes our enzymes to cease to work. It takes a lot of energy for water to change temperature, so this means that it will heat and cool more slowly than the air or land. So as we just stated, this is useful to animals in hot climates. But instead of looking at the water as a habitat, it's also useful for animals in hot climates who can use the water or mud, if there is not a significant amount of water, to cool off in a hot day. So what happens when water evaporates? Well, when it evaporates, it removes a lot of energy from the system. This is felt as a cooling sensation because excess heat energy is removed from the body. This is the latent heat of evaporation. The skin and the blood vessels are cooled. This also helps aquatic animals remain at a fairly constant temperature on hot summers. Also interesting to note that water makes up 70% of the body, which includes the blood. Because it's resistant to temperature change, cooler blood from some parts of the body can be circulated to other parts, cooling it down. This is also beneficial in another property of water, which is a high boiling point of water, and this allows water to remain liquid over a broad range of temperatures, which is helpful for our body since it is made up of 70% water. All right, another property of water is the solvent property of water. Water is a good solvent because it's a polar molecule. It will dissolve polar solutes easily. You have an ionic solid, such as sodium chloride or salt, and that's going to dissociate in water. When it dissociates in water, the bonds break and you get sodium ions and chloride ions. The polar attractions of water cause the water molecules to surround and isolate the solute molecules. The more soluble a solute is, the easier it is for the ions to be isolated from each other. And so they end up in a thicker water shell. So the water forms a shell around charged and polar molecules, and this keeps these molecules from clumping together and also keeps them within the solution. So we're going to look at a quick animation.
Let's add a small amount of table salt, sodium chloride, to water. As you know, sodium chloride dissolves in water. Click on the zoom button to view sodium chloride dissolving in water on a microscopic scale. Polar water molecules interact with the positive and negative ions of a salt. The positive ends of the water molecules are attracted to the negative chloride ions. The negative ends of the water molecules are attracted to the positive sodium ions. This interaction between water and the salt ions causes a salt to break apart or dissolve in water.
All right, water is also a medium for metabolic reactions because it's a good solvent. The dissolved particles are able to move around, which allows them to diffuse through membranes and biological surfaces. So the moving particles are likely to collide with one another, which can also lead to reaction. Almost all of our metabolic reactions, which are reactions inside of our living things, occur in solution. And this means that the reactants are dissolved in water. So as stated, dissolved particles can diffuse through membranes and biological surfaces. This is because they are wet. Because they are wet, this allows the molecules to dissolve, including gases to dissolve, so that they can diffuse through the membranes more easily. For example, here in our alveoli, which are in our lungs, the oxygen is dissolved on the membrane and then can then be diffused into the blood. Over here, we have blood itself. Blood plasma is actually a really good transport system for the human body. Sodium chloride dissolves, we've already seen that, into sodium ions and chloride ions, which can be carried in the blood. Amino acids. There are some amino acids that are hydrophobic and some that are hydrophilic, but all are able to be soluble and to be carried within the blood. Glucose is a freely soluble polar molecule. Oxygen is a nonpolar molecule, but it dissolves in water because it's very small in size. Now, dissolved oxygen in the blood is not enough for our body to conduct our aerobic reactions for cellular respiration, so we need the protein hemoglobin to increase the amount of oxygen that the blood can carry. We do also carry fat molecules and cholesterol in our blood. Both of these are nonpolar. Fat molecules are also too large to be dissolved in water, so they must be carried within something called a lipoprotein complex. And cholesterol is also cannot be carried in the blood because of its nonpolar nature, so it travels within the lipoproteins as well. All right, so we've heard the terms hydrophilic and hydrophobic before, and we've referred to hydrophilic as being water-loving. But this is really just substances that are chemically attracted to water. Polar molecules such as glucose, positively charged molecules such as sodium ions, negatively charged ions such as chloride ions, and then just substances that water adheres to naturally such as glucose. We commonly refer to hydrophobic as being water-fearing, but it's not technically water-fearing. It's just any molecule or compound that does not have a positive or negative charge and is nonpolar. These molecules cannot dissolve in water, but they can actually dissolve in other liquids. Nonpolar molecules also frequently have hydrophobic interactions, and this is the interaction between water molecules and the nonpolar molecules. So when we have two nonpolar molecules within a water solution or a liquid water, the attraction between the water molecules can be much stronger than the attraction between the nonpolar molecules and the water. So then the water will frequently surround the nonpolar molecules, and that causes the nonpolar molecules to clump together, although they themselves are not attracted to each other. So the last thing we want to do is compare the thermal properties of water with those of methane. And why do we want to do that? Well, water and methane are both very small molecules, and they're both molecules with atoms that are linked by single covalent bonds. A methane is a central carbon surrounded by 4 individual covalently bonded hydrogens, and then water is our central oxygen with 2 hydrogens covalently bonded to it. But the water is polar and can form hydrogen bonds. Methane, on the other hand, is a nonpolar molecule and can't form hydrogen bonds. This difference of the nonpolar and the polar is really what causes most of the differences that we see down here with their properties. It causes the differences between the density, specific heat capacity, latent heat of vaporization or evaporation. The melting point differences are huge, and as are the boiling point differences. So where do we find methane? Well, it's a waste product of anaerobic respiration, and it can also be used as a fuel. It's present in the atmosphere and can contribute to the greenhouse effect. That's it for our water notes today. I hope you've enjoyed.